A few hours ago in Shanghai, Max Verstappen got out of the RB22, looked at the data, and immediately realized something that could change the entire Formula One season. Red Bull was not fighting for pole. They were barely inside the top 10. Verstappen qualified 8th. Isaac Hadjar qualified 9th. And the gap to pole position was more than 1.5 seconds. In modern Formula One, that is not just a bad lap. That is a serious warning. Because when analysts started comparing the data, something even more worrying appeared. The RB22 is losing time in every part of the track. Corner entry, mid-corner balance, corner exit traction, even the long straight in Shanghai. Which means this might not be a simple setup issue. It might be something much deeper. And according to what Verstappen discovered after qualifying, the problem could be connected to the brand new Ford power unit. A system that may not be delivering power consistently. Something that can silently steal tenths of a second every lap. Something drivers feel immediately. And something engineers cannot fix overnight. Meanwhile, Mercedes just locked the front row. Ferrari is clearly ahead. McLaren is fighting near the top. And Red Bull, the team that dominated the previous era, suddenly looks like the fourth fastest car on the grid. So the question everyone in the paddock is asking tonight is simple. Is the Ford-powered RB22 already in serious trouble? And what exactly did Verstappen discover in the data that left the entire Red Bull garage worried? Only a few hours before this moment, the situation inside the Red Bull garage already felt strange. Because the warning signs did not appear suddenly in qualifying. They started much earlier in the weekend. During the sprint sessions, the RB22 already looked uncomfortable on track. Not dramatically slow, but unstable. Difficult to place in the corners. And that is something you almost never see with a Red Bull car. Especially with Max Verstappen behind the wheel. Normally, Red Bull cars are known for one thing. Precision. Sharp front end. A rear that stays planted when the driver attacks the throttle. But in Shanghai, something felt different. From the very first laps, Verstappen was fighting the car. Small corrections on corner entry. Tiny slides through the middle of long turns. Moments where the rear of the car refused to stay stable. At first, engineers believed it could be a setup issue. Shanghai is a difficult track. Long corners. Heavy loads on the tires. A very long straight that forces teams to compromise between downforce and speed. So the team began adjusting the setup. More rear wing. Different suspension balance. Small changes to ride height. But every change seemed to create a new problem. Add more rear wing, the car becomes slower on the straight. Reduce drag, the rear becomes unstable in long corners. Adjust the suspension, the balance shifts again. It was like chasing a moving target. And that is usually the first sign that a car might be operating outside its ideal performance window. Then came the sprint qualifying. And that is when the frustration really started. Because the RB22 was nowhere near the front. Mercedes looked extremely fast. Ferrari and McLaren were clearly ahead. And Verstappen sounded increasingly irritated over the radio. Short answers. Direct messages. No confidence in the balance of the car. At one point, he described the feeling in very simple terms. The car had no grip, no balance, and no predictable behavior in the corners. For a driver like Verstappen, that is a nightmare. Because his driving style depends on trusting the rear of the car. He attacks corner entry aggressively, carries speed through the middle, and then launches out of the corner using maximum traction. But if the rear of the car moves unpredictably, that entire style collapses. Suddenly the driver must lift earlier, brake slightly sooner, wait longer before applying throttle. Each of those tiny adjustments costs time. Just a fraction of a second in one corner. But when it happens again and again throughout the lap, the deficit becomes massive. And that is exactly what Red Bull saw during the sprint sessions. The RB22 simply could not keep up with the leaders. But at that point, the team still believed they could recover. They had more data, more time to adjust the setup. And qualifying for the main race was still ahead. So engineers spent hours studying telemetry. Comparing Verstappen's laps with the fastest cars. Looking for something obvious. Something they could fix quickly. But when the main qualifying session finally began, the result told a different story. Because even after all those adjustments, the RB22 still looked uncomfortable. Still unstable. Still missing performance in key sections of the track. Verstappen managed to reach the final stage of qualifying. Hadjar did the same. But the lap times revealed the truth. Red Bull was not fighting for pole. They were simply trying to limit the damage. And when Verstappen finished his final lap, the gap to the fastest car was shocking. More than 1.5 seconds. In Formula One terms, that is enormous. And that was the moment when Verstappen started asking deeper questions. Because the car did not just feel slow, it felt inconsistent. One corner the balance felt acceptable. The next corner the rear would suddenly lose stability. Then on the straight, the acceleration did not always feel the same. That inconsistency is what immediately caught Verstappen's attention, because drivers at his level noticed tiny differences instantly. And when he stepped out of the car after qualifying, the conversation with engineers quickly moved toward one specific area: the power delivery. More precisely, the hybrid deployment of the new Ford power unit. And the data they were about to analyze would reveal something that could explain far more than just one difficult qualifying session. But the more engineers studied the telemetry from qualifying, the stranger the picture became. Because the RB22 was not just lacking grip. It was behaving differently from one moment to the next. On one lap, the acceleration looked normal. On the next lap, something changed. The power delivery felt slightly delayed. Not a complete loss of power. Something much smaller. But in Formula One, small differences create huge consequences. And Verstappen felt it immediately on the longest straight in Shanghai. That back straight is one of the most important acceleration zones on the entire calendar. Cars reach incredible speeds there, which means the hybrid system must deploy energy perfectly. Every single time. If the deployment hesitates for even a fraction of a second, the car loses speed instantly. And according to the data Red Bull reviewed after qualifying, those tiny interruptions may be costing Verstappen several tenths of a second on that straight alone. That might sound small, but in qualifying, 3 tenths is the difference between pole position and the fourth row. Now imagine losing that time every lap. Suddenly the gap to the front begins to make sense. But here is where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because the hybrid deployment is not failing completely. Sometimes it works perfectly. Sometimes it does not. Which makes the problem extremely difficult to diagnose. For the driver, that inconsistency is devastating. Because when you exit a corner and apply full throttle, you expect the car to respond exactly the same way every time. If the power delivery changes from lap to lap, confidence disappears immediately. And confidence is everything in Formula One. Without it, even the fastest driver cannot attack the limit. But the hybrid system might only be part of the story. Because when engineers compared the data from different corners of the circuit, another pattern started to appear. The RB22 seemed particularly uncomfortable in long, sustained turns. Exactly the type of corner that dominates the Shanghai circuit. Take the famous opening corner. A long spiral that tightens slowly. Drivers enter at high speed. Then gradually increase steering angle while balancing throttle and braking. The car must remain perfectly stable during that entire sequence. Any weakness in the floor or rear aerodynamics becomes obvious there. And during qualifying, the Red Bull struggled in exactly that section. The rear moving slightly. The car refusing to rotate smoothly. Small corrections from Verstappen just to keep the car on line. Each correction costs a fraction of a second. But more importantly, it destroys rhythm. And rhythm is critical during a qualifying lap. Once the driver loses that flow, the lap begins to fall apart. But some insiders inside the paddock believe this behavior could be linked to another factor. A small experimental floor modification that Red Bull reportedly brought to China. Nothing dramatic. Just a subtle adjustment to the floor edge and diffuser interaction. The goal was simple. Increase rear stability. Improve aerodynamic consistency through long corners. But according to several whispers inside the paddock, the change may not have worked as expected. Instead of stabilizing the car, it may have made the RB22 even more sensitive to ride height and airflow disruption. And if that suspicion is correct, the consequences could be serious. Because in modern Formula One, the floor generates most of the car's downforce. If the floor concept becomes unstable, the entire aerodynamic balance collapses. Rear grip disappears. The driver loses confidence. And suddenly the car becomes extremely difficult to optimize. Which brings us back to the biggest concern Red Bull engineers are now facing. Because when multiple problems appear at the same time, the real challenge is understanding which one is the root cause. Is the issue coming from the hybrid system? Is it coming from the floor aerodynamics? Is it simply a setup problem? Or is the RB22 suffering from a deeper design compromise? That is the question being asked inside the paddock tonight. Because while Red Bull tries to understand its car, the competition is already moving forward. Mercedes dominated qualifying in Shanghai. Ferrari looks extremely competitive. McLaren continues to fight near the front. And suddenly Red Bull finds itself in a position it has not experienced for years. Chasing the leaders. Not controlling the race weekend. And the most uncomfortable part of this entire situation is that the season has only just begun. This is only the second race weekend of the championship. which means Red Bull still has time to react. But Formula One development cycles are brutal. If the base concept of a car is wrong, fixing it can take months, sometimes the entire season. And if the RB22 truly has a narrow operating window combined with unstable hybrid deployment, then the challenge facing Red Bull may be much bigger than one difficult qualifying session in Shanghai. Because the real fear inside the garage tonight is not just losing one race. The real fear is something far more serious. That Verstappen may have just discovered the first sign of a car that cannot fight for the championship. But what truly worries Red Bull tonight is not just the lap time. It is the pattern behind the lap time. Because when engineers finished comparing the telemetry from Shanghai with the data collected in Australia just a week earlier, a strange connection started to appear. Some of the same symptoms were already there. Small instability on corner entry, unpredictable rear balance, and most importantly, strange behavior in the energy deployment system. In Australia, that issue was hidden behind a much bigger problem: the engine failure that forced Verstappen to retire from the race. At the time, many people inside the paddock believed it was simply an isolated reliability issue. A new power unit. Early season stress. Nothing unusual. But after what happened in China, some engineers are starting to ask a different question. What if those two problems are connected? Because the RB22 is running an entirely new power unit architecture developed together with Ford. A massive project. Years in development. But still brand new on track. And the 2026 regulations place enormous pressure on the hybrid system. More electrical energy. More complex deployment strategies. More aggressive energy recovery. Everything has to work perfectly together. The battery. The control electronics. The MGUK. And the software that decides when power is deployed during a lap. If even one of those elements behaves inconsistently, the driver feels it immediately. And that is exactly what Verstappen described after qualifying. Moments where the power delivery feels slightly delayed. Tiny interruptions when exiting corners. Acceleration that does not always feel identical from lap to lap. For fans watching on television, those differences are invisible. But for a Formula One driver, they are impossible to ignore. Because when you exit a corner at 300 km/h potential speed ahead of you, the car must respond instantly. If the hybrid system hesitates even slightly, the lap time disappears. But the deeper problem is psychological. Drivers rely on repetition. They build confidence when the car behaves exactly the same way every lap. But if the car responds differently each time the throttle is applied, the driver stops trusting it. And when confidence disappears, performance disappears with it. That may explain why Verstappen sounded so frustrated during the weekend. Not just because the car was slow, but because it was unpredictable. And unpredictability is the enemy of performance. But there is another layer to this story that makes the situation even more uncomfortable for Red Bull. Because while the RB22 struggles with balance and deployment issues, the competition looks stronger than ever. Mercedes dominated qualifying in China, locking the front row with incredible pace. Ferrari is clearly the second fastest team, consistently ahead of Red Bull.